is money, honey. All we talk is money. All we talk is money. It's like bees to the honey. Honey, money, honey, money, honey. It's the SOSCAST, baby.
All right, thank you. All right, welcome to SOSCAST. A very unique episode that we're having today. You know that typically we cover culture, politics, dating, relationships, money. But part of what's going on in American culture today is this ongoing debate, especially in American society today, with what's going on with Israel and Palestine, and what's going on specifically in college campuses that have been going all over these protests for the last few weeks, really. They've been really coalescing on campus. And today, we're going to have a conversation with Rudy Rochman. Did I say that correctly?
Rudy Rochman.
Rudy Rochman, I rolled the CH, about what's going on. Israeli advocate, Jewish American.
I have U.S. citizenship, yeah.
U.S. citizen, also IDF soldier.
Yes.
Co-hosting today, my friend Aaron. I said, Aaron, do you know any friends of yours who are super pro-Palestine? She said, Adam, I am that friend. So I said, listen, I was going to have a one-on-one interview with Rudy, especially to bring attention to what's going on here from, I would say, a very worldly wise individual. You travel the world, you talk about this, you've been all over the world. I said, me interviewing Rudy could only do so much, because you guys know where I stand on this subject. Zionist, pro-Israel. But I also agree that governments, even the Israeli government, can be criticized. Totally understandable. I criticize the American government all the time, and I'm very, very much pro-American. But I wanted to take an extra step further and invite Aaron here because I feel like you'll ask questions that maybe I wouldn't ask, or maybe ask questions that the audience would want to ask, and you're not going to be as lenient on my friend Rudy as I am. Because, again, we have different stances on this. You okay with that?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So I want to get right into this because we have an hour and we're going to go very fast. Rudy, obviously Israeli advocate. You see what's going on college campuses today. I believe there's a clip or even some headlines of what's going on out there that we can even put out there. I've gone on said that I think that the Palestine protests, the campus protests, is the new BLM from 2020. In 2016, it was the Me Too movement. 2020, it was BLM. And 2024, it's Peace for Palestine, Gays for Gaza, the whole thing. The pro-Palestinian protests have disrupted colleges all across the United States. Here's some headlines. Columbia in New York City. Columbia protesters seize building as anti-war demonstrations intensify. Columbia University is now policy-making Senate votes for a resolution calling to investigate schools' leadership. Harvard, anti-Israel protests fly Palestinian flag in spot reserved for the American flag. Horror as GW, George Washington University protester carries Nazi final solution call for the extermination of Jews signs. And then ultimately, college kids are now finally, this is a Daily Mail article, are starting to, there's the woke college kids and then basically the more sensible type who are basically saying, I can't do the Ivy League thing, and they're now transferring to Southern schools. I want to understand a few things. From your perspective, why are these college campuses protests happening? What do you think they're right about? What do you think they're wrong about?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, Columbia University is my alma mater. That's where I went to. Right out of the Army, I actually started university at UCLA before transferring to Columbia. And I realized that what was going on college campuses already then and even before my time, where there are groups that claim to be pro-Palestinian. And the reason I say they claim to be pro-Palestinian is because when Palestinians are dying by the thousands in the Syrian civil war, they don't talk about them. When they're by the hundreds of thousands of refugee camps in Lebanon and in Jordan, they don't mention them. When they're suffering under Hamas, when they're suffering under the Palestinian Authority, or on the border of Gaza and Egypt, there's no mention of them. They only talk about Palestinian suffering when it has to do with Israel. Now, of course, there's a lot of Palestinian suffering when it has to do with Israel. These are my cousins, so I care about them. But if you take instances of Palestinian suffering only when it fits your agenda, you remove the entire context as to how we even got into the situation, to understand it and to correct it, and use it as political ammunition to delegitimize my connection to the land and my identity, what's really going on is an attempt to convince the future political and intellectual class of the next generation, which is what universities create. The next politicians, the next businessmen, the next people in media are coming from the universities, and convincing them that if they want to make the world a better place, they have to be against Israel. Now, I realized this when I was at UCLA. I realized also that within the Jewish community, we had a lack of activism ourselves. You know, you don't want to hear about black rights from KKK members. You don't want to hear about women rights from misogynists. So are the only people talking about Jewish rights are those that are anti-Israel and anti the Jewish people? So I went on Google and I typed in #1 most anti-Semitic university in North America. Columbia University was listed #1, as clearly was still,
and that's where you
still
went
a problem.
to school.
And I transferred there. And I created a grassroots student movement that wasn't right-wing, left-wing. A lot of our work was actually bringing in Israelis and Palestinians for people to understand. And our goal was to empower, to narrate, and to protect, meaning to empower our own core students, Jews and non-Jewish allies, to be able to stand up for themselves, narrate our story using a language that communicates who we are, and to make sure to counter any and every single anti-Semitic movement that existed. What's happening on college campuses is an attempt to indoctrinate the next generation and to manipulate the empathy that they have for legitimate Palestinian suffering, and to ride on that to give them a zero-sum game narrative that if you want to be pro-Palestinian, you must be anti-Israel. And the reality is, if you're anti-either population, you're anti-both, because there's no future where either will disappear.
So, very interesting. You Googled the #1 anti-Israel university.
Anti-Semitic university.
Anti-Semitic university.
Same thing.
I like saying anti-Israel or Jewish hate.
Yeah.
Your friend taught me that.
Yes.
Because anti-Semitic, what is Semitic? Like, Jews don't run around being like, Semites, we rule.
Right.
Semites is you come from a region.
Right.
You could be Arab and Semitic. So
Correct.
to me, it's a very loose terminology. Anti-Jewish
Yeah, Jewish hate,
makes sense.
anti-Jewish.
Jewish
yeah.
hate, anti-Israel makes a lot more sense to me. So you Google this word, and Columbia University comes up. But then there's how many Jews in the world?
There's 15 million recognized Jews.
15 million Jews, okay? 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. Outside of Israel, the most Jews are where? In the United States.
Correct.
But in the United States, the most Jews reside in New York City. There's about 1 million Jews who live in New York City. The vast majority of Jews live in major cities, New York City, LA, Miami, right, where we grow up, where Aaron lives as well now. 1 million Jews in New York City. Walk me through, so if you went to Columbia is in Harlem.
It's near Harlem, just
Near
south of Harlem.
I've spent time there. One of my best friends went to school there and actually went to medical school there. So I've spent time at Columbia. Walk me through how you think this works, this logic works. The most Jews outside of Israel live in the United States. The most amount of Jews that live in the United States live in New York. But in New York, Columbia University, the most amount of Jewish hate stems from. Walk me through this logic, if you can.
Well, let me give you some more numbers. In New York City, the Jewish population is 13% of the population, right? A minority. But yet over 60% of total hate crimes against any minority is specifically against the Jews. And that's before October 7th, for which anti-Semitism has skyrocketed in these different places. So it's clearly there's an obsession against the Jewish people. Now, you might first be surprised by where there's a lot of Jews, there's a lot of anti-Semitism. How does that make sense?
Yeah.
But if we look at the Holocaust, it really started out of Berlin. There are many Jews in Berlin as well. So it's not because you have many Jews in a place that is prone to not being going through some sort of anti-Semitic experience. Quite to the contrary. Usually societies reject the Jewish people and blame us for all problems, and they blame us in places where we exist. And that's what's happening also in New York.
So these student protests, I want to understand this. From your perspective, you know, I asked you straight up, I said, do you have any pro-Palestinian friends? You said, Adam, I am that friend. I'm that. Why do you think these college kids, these woke, progressive college kids, as they're being labeled, are so anti-Israel and so pro-Palestine?
I guess I would take umbrage with the framing of the question because I don't know that they're anti-Israel per se. I think the demands of the college protests are very clear. They want their campuses to divest from Israel so long as the hostilities and bombardment in Gaza is going on. They want amnesty from any repercussions and punishment and fallout as a result of the protests. And they also want more transparency with Columbia's financial ties to Israel. I think these are reasonable demands that don't necessarily constitute anti-Israel sentiments.
Okay, so fair enough.
I'd like to respond to that.
They're anti-war. Respond to this. Cue up that Joe Scarborough clip from Dave Rubin if you can. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So if that were the case, then I definitely agree that that would not necessarily be anti-Semitic, because I don't know one person in Israel that doesn't criticize the Israeli government. There's nothing wrong with criticizing a government, but we have to be specific. What are the policies that we disagree with? What would we like to see? What are the actions that we're against with? Not just these blanket terms and being against an entire society or country, but being specific with where the problems are. But when you look in college campuses, they're calling for the intifada. Intifada literally means to kill Jews. They're promoting Hamas terrorists, they're wearing Hamas headbands, they're pushing Jews out, they're preventing Jews from going to classes. So it's not just being pro the Palestinians, it's completely turned into being against Israel and against the Jewish people. And that's from every single Jewish experience on college campuses. My brother is at Columbia University. He's landing right now from the airport because he cannot go to classes anymore. So the situation that's erupted is basically he now has to take online classes because he's no longer safe to come into Columbia's campus. That's no longer a political statement saying we want to help the Palestinians come out of their situations, and so we're going to put pressure and we're going to target specific companies who profit from the war, so that's why we're against them. And even the boycotting, it's not boycotting of specific companies, it's boycotting of anything related to Israel. Even a film, even a musician, even a person. Now, just because you're Israeli, we need to boycott you, right? You're an American. Would you want someone to boycott you because you might not agree with Trump or Biden or any president that comes around and they're against that person, and so now you're automatically associated to that? So it's presented on a surface level as it's pro-Palestinian, which I'm also that pro-Palestinian friend, right? I'm more than pro-Palestinian because Palestinians are my cousins. They're my family. Right, I'm pro-human life, but Palestinians are in even closer degree closer to me. But it's now being used as we're going to pretend to care about the Palestinian in order to really fulfill our goal and our agenda, which is to attack the Jewish people and delegitimize our connection to our homeland.
You keep saying that Palestinians are your cousins.
Yes.
Walk me through that logic. I don't see a lot of Jews or Muslims, for that matter, or Arabs saying, my family, my mishbucha, I love you, I miss you. I see a lot of, I kill you, please don't. Like, walk me through that. Your family is from where originally?
So originally every Jew is from Israel. We were displaced 2,000 years ago. Some of us stayed in the land, and we had different diasporic experiences. Part of my family went to North Africa, to Algeria and Morocco. The other part of my family survived the Holocaust in Poland and Belgium, leading to my parents both being born in France, me being born in France. But wherever we are as Jews, the reason we're called Jews is because we were kicked out from a land called Judea. It is not our religion, it's the portable version of our ancient civilization. And so as Jews, we come from Judea, aka Israel. As Israelites, this is where we're from, this is where our culture was born, rooted to, and belongs to. Now, Palestinians, first of all, Arabs in general are our cousins. Sem, we were talking about Semitic. Sem is a person, he's the child of Noah. Now, the descendants of Sem are the Semites who are living in the Middle East. So all Middle Easterners are part of this Semitic family. Today, the word Semitic is really talking about a language, a Semitic language. So Arabic, Amharic, Hebrew, Arabic, all sorts of languages that are Semitic languages. Now, specifically the Palestinians, what's fascinating is that 30 to 60% of them in total descend from Jews that were converted to Christianity and Islam over time. And if you go to places like Haifa, Jerusalem, Yafo, Yatta, Safed, Tzfat, Shechem, Hebron, places that are actually ancient Jewish villages, 80 to 90% of their DNA is Jewish DNA. So it's more than just an Arab-Jewish cousin relationship. We're even closer to them. And so once we start understanding that, we no longer see each other as outsiders. Many Jews that are, let's say, on the far right will look at Palestinians and say, oh, you guys are a bunch of foreign Arabs who've come and poured into the land and you don't belong here. And many extremist Palestinians will say, oh, well, the Jews are a bunch of fake white Europeans who've come from the outside. But once we understand that historically, genetically, linguistically, culturally, archaeologically, anthropologically, we descend from the same roots, it's much harder to reject one another.
But do you think people, I guess, to put it bluntly, care about that? Meaning, okay, great, you all came from the same place, the biblical Moses, Abraham. They're like, yeah, but what about today? There's a like. Do you think those protesters care about what he just asked? What he just said?
The protesters aren't going to be monolithic. I'm sure there's going to be people that actually agree with a lot of what he just said. There's going to be dissenting opinions. I think you'd probably see a lot of ideological diversity within this movement if you went up to each individual protester and asked them their thoughts and feelings. I wouldn't want to like give a blanket statement and speak for any like protests as a whole. Protesters as a whole, I think they'd have to articulate that themselves.
So there's being idealistic and like, I would love, like, would you say that you're idealistic? Like, meaning, like, I believe that we can all get along and live together one day.
I would say that every person that changed history was idealistic and was
Okay.
told that they were idealistic and utopian by people who didn't believe so. And
Got
because
it.
they didn't listen to them, they changed history.
Got it. So there's idealistic and realistic.
Correct.
I don't want to have a whole conversation about 1948 and then the Israeli independence and then the war of 1948 and then 1967 and the border and the 70s. I don't want to go there. But how realistic is it, especially with Hamas, a known terrorist organization, the Hezbollah, just to the north of Israel, the Houthi rebels in the Red Sea, Iran with their tentacles everywhere. How realistic that Israel will ever have peace in that region, especially with Gaza and the West Bank and Hamas running the show there? How realistic is it? Give me like 2% chance, 1% chance, 50%. What is realistic in the next 20 to 40 years?
Well, that it will eventually find a solution 100%. The question is how long, and it will depend on what we do. You know, if we had this conversation before 48, a lot of people would say, well, how realistic is it that a Jewish state will re-exist back on their ancient homeland? And a lot of people denied that that was a possibility, and yet it's here. Or how will Israel survive? Or how will we ever have peace with Egypt? Nasser was the head against Israel and the creation of Israel, leading the entire Arab world, and yet this country now has peace with Israel. Jordan has peace with Israel. The Emirates have peace with Israel. Saudi Arabia might soon have peace with Israel. Maybe even Lebanon in our very near future after the war with Hezbollah might have peace with Israel. So things can change, but we need to go to the source. Now, Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people. Yes, there are many Palestinians who support Hamas, but Hamas does not represent the Palestinians. They are on their 18th year of their 4-year term. If we look at Hezbollah, Hezbollah does not represent the Lebanese people. Yes, you'll find many Lebanese who agree with that, but these groups are those who are controlling them, dominating them, and giving them horrible lives, and they are the ones who are causing the problem. So I like to separate Hamas from the Palestinians, and if I look towards a future with Palestinians included in that future with Israelis, it does not include Hamas, of course.
Okay. I want to sort of put a ribbon on the student protest thing. You know, you said that it's not monolithic, that they're not necessarily anti-Israel, they're anti-war, right? Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. It's not the only war that's going on in the world, and it's certainly not the only war that's going on in the region. There's been the war in Yemen. There's been the war in Syria.
Sudan.
There's been a war in Sudan. There's been Lebanese conflict with... Why don't I see any other protests on any other campus? Afghanistan, Iraq, what's going on in Iran. Iran is going to put to death a rapper right now. We'll talk about that. Zero protests. Zero. We'll play this clip by Joe Scarborough. Why do you think it's only the Israel protests?
Well, I think the reason why is because people are uncomfortable with the fact that 34,000 Palestinians have died in Gaza so far. Over 25,000 have been women and children.
Okay.
And when they see their government, the USA, directly supporting, aiding, and abetting this onslaught in Palestine and Gaza specifically, they're very uncomfortable by that. You know, like you can look at different, areas of conflict within the world globally, but the first question you have to ask yourself is like, is my government supporting that? Do I have a say over that? Like, for example, I don't have a say over the Uyghur genocide in China, right? My government's not directly funding that, but the United States is an ally to Israel, one of the biggest allies to Israel, and we are providing weapons, we're providing aid, and we are helping assist them in this. And I think that's what makes people particularly uncomfortable, and why in this moment people feel like it's important to seize upon all the public attention that's directed towards this conflict and try to channel it into something positive.
Fair enough. I'm going to show you this clip, and I want you to respond to this. But do you know who the biggest provider of funds to the Palestinians are?
Maybe Qatar?
America. Do you know this stat?
Oh, with aid?
With aid.
Sure.
So, the running joke is we're providing bombs to Israel, but also food to the Palestinians. It's a very dicey conflict. Would you at least be willing to acknowledge Hamas is a terrorist group and they have to go?
I would agree that Hamas is a terrorist group, and I would agree that I don't believe that they're a good steward for Palestinian autonomy leadership.
Okay.
I think they're a brutal resistance group, and I think Palestinians deserve better than that. But I will say, just as a matter of principle, if I'm interested in seeing Palestinian statehood, Palestinian sovereignty, I do believe that Palestinians have to be able to make the choice who their leaders are going to be. But given the recent polling, Hamas doesn't enjoy that much support from Palestinians whatsoever. So I find it very, very unlikely that they're going to be reelected.
What are the approval ratings for Hamas in Palestine and Gaza these days?
There's
I think it's pretty high.
There's no even election to begin with. I mean, there was one election, and at that time, Hamas was running on a very different campaign than what it is today. In fact, it was presenting itself as better than Fatah, which is what the Palestinian Authority is, and that they'd be more.
That's Mahmoud Abbas's party.
Yeah, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, and that they'd be more willing to engage with Israel. Actually, many Israeli politicians were supporting the idea that Hamas would take over because it would be finally something new that we could negotiate with. And then Hamas turned to what it was. So even the fact that Hamas was elected to begin with, I don't think we could go retroactively and say, oh, well, it proves that Palestinians truly wanted what eventually Hamas done. Also, there are many polls that talk about how Palestinians approve of Hamas. We have to understand there's no freedom of speech in Gaza. If you say something against Hamas, you disappear. So if someone is going around asking Palestinians in Gaza, what do you think about Hamas, with Hamas militants next to them, they're probably going to say that they approve of Hamas. So I think even the polls are not accurate to represent what the people have. I think being in Gaza a few months ago, I know that Palestinians, for the most part in Gaza, are now rejecting of Hamas, seeing what they've done, seeing how they've treated their own civilians while they were living there, seeing the destruction that they've caused with what happened on October 7th and afterwards. So I say overall, the Palestinians in Gaza are mostly rejecting Hamas. That doesn't mean that they're pro-Israel. But there is one number that I did want to talk about. You know, we're throwing around this number 30,000, more than 30,000, and we're not realizing that, first of all, it's completely inflated. But besides that inflation, 15,000 of that number are Hamas terrorists. There's no 30,000 plus civilians and the Hamas terrorists. We're including the terrorists in the number. Now, many of those terrorists may be 17, 16 years old that went into Israel on October 7th, raped and killed people, and we're considering that that's a child, which, again, when we hear women and children, we're expecting 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. And what I'd like to say is one Palestinian civilian dead is one person dead too much. Because this is my family, and I don't want to see one person dying. But when we take the terrorists and we include them in the number of the civilians dying, then it gives a false image of what's actually happening. So I don't want to talk less about what's happening. I want to talk more, but to be specific and to be accurate with the information.
Yeah, like we just saw the priest in Australia, Priest Marimar, that was just on the PBD podcast, I don't know, less than 6 months ago. He was stabbed, attacked by an Islamic extremist, teenager, 17 years old. By definition, he's a child. So if someone like that, an extremist of any capacity, is killed in a war, that is a child being killed in war. This guy tried to kill a priest. Secondly, we're also making the assumption that a woman can't shoot a gun or pull a trigger or throw a bomb. So nobody wants to see dead people. The images of dead babies anywhere, horrific. But something does need to be said about Hamas's entire blueprint, entire game plan, is they do embed themselves in civilian populations.
I can speak about that.
You were an IDF soldier.
Yes.
Like you did an interview that you were in Khan Yunis.
Yes, I was the first unit into Khan Yunis.
Which is, if you don't, there's Gaza City, there's Rafah that people are at, but Khan Yunis is what, the second biggest city?
Yeah, one of the.
That's where allegedly the leader of Hamas,
Sinwar.
Yahya Sinwar, is hiding out. What was that experience like?
So for me, the war started as a reservist. I've been out of the army for 10 years. Actually, a lot of my work in the line is uniting Israelis and Palestinians so that we don't get into this situation. None of us want to see war. Unfortunately, on October 7th, we all know what took place with the massacres of the Jewish people, the rape, the burning, the cutting up into pieces, and I was called up into war. By 5 p.m., I was in Kfar Aza, which was one of the hardest hit communities that Hamas had hit on that date. Fought Hamas for 2 days, and then about a month later, our unit was taken into Khan Yunis as the first unit into Khan Yunis. When we got in there were no civilians. There was only one civilian that we saw. You know how you go on the streets and you see sometimes homeless people who have mental health issues and they're schizophrenic and they scream. So there was a lady, a woman, who was just like screaming, and she clearly had mental health issues. She had been left behind for some reason, and so we took her and we brought her to where there were civilian refugees. That was the only civilian that we saw. We also saw leaflets that the IDF had sent that was written in Arabic that you have X amount of hours to leave because we're going to come in with a frontal entrance from the IDF, so make sure that everyone's gone. But in all the civilian areas, houses, schools, you had terror tunnels, right? Hamas had built the scene for a war zone knowing that we would go in and being prepared. In the houses, they were booby-trapped with explosives to kill soldiers on the way, which many of my friends, unfortunately, died in this combat. And Hamas would pop out, come at us, shoot, attack. I didn't see any women Hamas terrorists. I'm not saying that that can exist. It was mostly men. It was mostly younger men. But unfortunately, that is the experience that we went through. Now, have there been civilian casualties that have died? Of course. But In no time have those civilians been killed because Israel said, oh, there are Palestinian civilians, let's go and kill those individuals. Every single time Palestinian civilians have been killed, which is horrible, the fact that this is happening, which is why we need to do everything to prevent ourselves from being in war in the first place. Every single time that civilians have died is because Israel was being fired at by Hamas. It needed to fire back. It warned the civilians to get out of place. Hamas forces those civilians to stay there. Israel shoots back and civilians die. This is what happens in war. But the difference is that Israel does everything to prevent civilian casualties and targets Hamas, while Hamas tries everything to maximize civilian casualties on both sides and specifically targets Israeli civilians. That is the difference here. So if we truly care about the problem of people suffering and dying on both sides, which I do, and we can be critical of the Israeli government. I have many critiques of the Israeli government. I mean, for 18 years, Hamas has been there. I didn't need to go into Khan Yunis to see all sorts of propagandas of teaching the youth how to hate the Jewish people in magazines, in comic books, in textbooks, in math books, in English books, of telling them the way to be an honorable person one day is to kill Jews. I didn't need to go there to know that that was happening. So why for 18 years has Israel allowed Hamas to exist, has allowed Hamas to manipulate its population, force its population to be in this loop of cycle of violence? Israel has the power, thus the responsibility to change the situation. So we can criticize Israel, but if we're going to talk about this situation, we have to be honest of what the intentions are of both sides.
Yeah, and very interesting. You made up a great point. In America here, in Israel, in any democracy, you're actually free to criticize the government. What happens if you criticize the government in Gaza?
Not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. I have many friends of mine that I work usually. You have to understand that the real leadership to Palestinians are not those in the Palestinian Authority and in Hamas. They're those who are local community leaders. You have different villages, they're almost tribal, and in each village you have one ruling family, and the patriarch of that family is the person that says, okay, this person hit that person stole this is what I say, you give that person, and they're really the ones who represent their population.
And if you criticize them, what happens?
Now, they are usually very open-minded to working with Israel because they care about the future of their people. But if they stand up and say something against the Palestinian Authority, against Hamas, or even on behalf of Israel, not even something against their own people, saying, we would like to see a future where we live with Israelis, they disappear. So there is no freedom of speech for Palestinians, and I think when many Jews from my side, many Israelis are like, well, why don't we hear the voices from their own side? Well, they don't have freedom of speech, and that's also another big critique that I have for Israel, is we need to create freedom of speech for Palestinians as well. If in the West Bank, there's a Jew living there who says something and all of a sudden a Palestinian goes and kills him, there's justice. The IDF will go find that person, try him, and they'll go to prison for what they did, dependent on what they did. If a Palestinian says something and another Palestinian kills him, Israel does nothing. Now, of course, they're under a different jurisdiction, but I think that Israel is important to enforce freedom of speech and the security of human life for every single individual. And if we did that, then we see other local leaders that would rise up and have different thoughts for the population.
I want to play this one clip from Joe Scarborough. I started the segment off talking about, I do think there is some sort of double standard when it comes to Israel. And you actually give a great example about American involvement. So you gave the example of, like, I care about the Uyghurs, but we're not involved in China. But America has, I think, 800 bases all over the world. We have relationships with pretty much every country other than our enemies. We're everywhere. And we have, America, again, to your point, we can be as critical as we want here, and we can still do a show and show up to work the next day. Here's why I think you brought up the numbers. Like, 30,000 people have died. It's horrible. It's disgusting. He kind of said, look, got to be kind of realistic with these numbers because at least half of them have been terrorists. Here's what Joe Scarborough had to say about the actual numbers compared to other countries and other wars.
Even with American wars, they don't add up.
I want to show you one more clip of that, of Scott Galloway on MSNBC. Here he is absolutely demolishing Mika Brzezinski. Mika Brzezinski, who is the wife
20 seconds.
of Joe Scarborough. And, well, just watch this.
One of my pet peeves seems to be one of your pet peeves, and that is, 2 million people have been killed in the Sudan civil war. I haven't seen a protest at NYU for that. Assad killed 500 Arabs. I didn't see colleges burned down. 500,000 Arabs killed by Assad. Saddam Hussein killed over 1 million Muslims in wars. I gassed them. I didn't see protests there. And yet your school is shut down right now because Israel is responding to the worst attack against Jews worldwide since the Holocaust. Help us sort through that.
And we can debate that response.
Again, I don't know algebra, but I'm pretty good at the common denominators here and why there's no common denominators in all of these. It's just that it's Jews defending their homeland. Because if you look at the numbers, even with American wars, they don't add up.
Well, first off, good to be with you, and I especially appreciate your leadership on this issue. I'll give you some more numbers. 2,200 American servicemen killed at Pearl Harbor. We go on to kill 3.5 million Japanese, including 100,000 in one night. 2,800 Americans in 9/11. We go on to kill 400,000 people in Afghanistan and Iraq. We weren't accused of genocide. You had, if Mexico had elected a jihadist cartel to run their country, and then they incurred into Texas, and on a per capita basis killed 35,000 people of the population of the University of Texas, and on the way back took the freshman class at SMU hostage and hid them under tunnels, what would we do? It'd be the great Sonora radioactive parking lot. But Jews are not allowed, and Israel is not allowed to prosecute a war. And they are prosecuting a war more humanely than we have done. The ratio of combatants to civilians is, of civilian death to combatant mortality is lower than it was in Mosul, lower than it was in Japan, lower than it was in Germany. So there's just a different standard for Jews in Israel when it comes to prosecuting a war. They're allowed to fight back to a truce. But unlike America or any other Western nation that has attacked this viciously, they're not allowed to win a war. It's a double standard.
Man, Galloway is really good, right? Like that.
So I actually genuinely want to get your opinion on this, because you have a great response. You're like, look, they've killed 30,000 people. I don't want to see this. I want to see American involvement. In the majority of what they just talked about, Syria, 500,000 people. Sudan, 2 million people. Iraq, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people between Afghanistan, Iraq. They pointed out World War II after Pearl Harbor, a couple thousand people died. We went and wiped out entire cities. None of these situations, when tens of hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people have died, was it called a genocide. Israel attacked October 7th, brutal, disgusting attack, which you know about all well too well. Waging a war. He said, listen, innocent victims are taken to war. It's horrible. 30,000 people. It's not anywhere near the level of hundreds of thousands or millions. Why do you think there's a double standard for Israel? He said to himself, Israel can only fight till there's a ceasefire. They can't actually win the war. Be unbiased. Why do you think that is?
I really don't feel like there's a double standard. Sometimes I feel like Israel is not held to any standard, just mostly because there are countless UN Security Council resolutions and other resolutions at the UN that Israel does not abide by. I feel like at this point they're attempting to find a military solution to what is at its root a political issue that's not going to be resolved unless the occupation ends, the blockade ends, and there are two states, or there's a settlement of the political conflict. There's Palestinian statehood, and there's the right of return granted to Palestinian refugees from the fallout of the Nakba, which was the day of catastrophe, or when over 700,000 Palestinians were expelled.
Do you believe that Israel is committing genocide right now?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
But there's been multiple statements made by high-ranking Israeli officials. For example, just a few days into Operation Swords of Iron, which is what Israel calls this current onslaught, Yoav Gallant, the Israel, I think, defense minister, secretary, said that there's not going to, that was when they announced the total siege on Gaza, that there wouldn't be any food, any water, any electricity that was permitted into Gaza, and said that they were dealing with human animals and would act accordingly. There's also been other Israeli officials that said that they're going for damage, not precision. So I think you can inductively reason just based off of statements like that as an example, as well as the ridiculously high death toll, one of which constitutes a lot of minors. If you aren't comfortable with the term children, you could say minors, people under the age of 18 who may or may not have been involved in hostilities. That is big cause for concern for most people.
This is what I love about this conversation, because I'm going to give this to you now. You're smart. You're not an idiot. You're not. Part of the narrative is that people in the protests are smart kids that go to very smart schools, but they're also known as useful idiots. They buy into propaganda. I'm not saying that about you, but you have very strong feelings. I'm going to throw some stats your way, and then I'm going to give a very shocking question. And then I'm going to let him respond. You talk about genocide. Jews know a thing or two about genocide.
You actually coined the term.
They coined the term, right? It's kind of our thing, guys. City of Gaza, 1990. 645,000 people live there. Today, 2.1 million, right? Mm-hmm. Not exactly a decline in population. World data, all of Palestinian population, 1990, 1.98 million. 2023, 5 million people. That's a 155% increase in the last 30 years. The numbers don't support a genocide. So I'm going to give a very shocking question right now. If you believe it's genocide, why doesn't Israel just kill all 2 million people in Palestine? Why don't they just, in Gaza, why don't they just do it? Just, you know what? You think we're doing genocide? The numbers are the exact opposite. We're growing. We have nuclear weapons. We clearly could kill all these people, but we're trying to be very precise and not kill innocent civilians. So if we are going to do genocide, why don't we just kill everybody? Why don't you think they're doing that?
Because genocide isn't a question of how many people have died. Genocide is a question of intentionality with respect to certain ethnic populations. That's the conditions of which they were killed. So and people often bring this up, like if Israel were really committing a genocide, if they're one of the strongest militaries in the world, if they're backed by the United States, why wouldn't they maximize the amount of people? Well, that is true that Israel has a military that is more than capable of eradicating every single person in Gaza, but then there's also public opinion to take into account. There's international law to take into account.
But public opinion is already against them. So like, I'm posing the question, and I'm going to let Rudy go in here now. I firmly believe there's embedded in many parts of society that there's just Jewish hate and they don't want the rights of Israel to exist. Example, October 7th happened. Israel didn't even have a chance to respond. You weren't even called into the military at this point. October 7th, October 8th, the world rejoiced. Israel hadn't fired one bullet. So don't tell me that there's no double standard, because clearly that was an example of that. I firmly believe, just by definition, that genocide is a reduction or a declination of population. They're multiplying like crazy. So you're actually a smart girl, but I'm actually pretty good at math. Genocide would be, there were 10 million Jews in Europe, now there's only 4 million. What happened to the other 6 million? Well, check the gas chambers, homie. In Gaza, there were 645,000, now there's 2 million. In Palestine, there was 1.98 million, now there's 5 million. I'm not seeing the genocide. Rudy, maybe I'm horrible at math, maybe I'm just a pro-Zionist. What am I missing here?
I think really the beauty in this conversation is that on the long term, we probably agree on what we'd like to see. And I hope that we eventually do get to that, because at some point this conflict will end and hopefully we'll be able to build off of those ideas. There are a lot of things that you said that I disagree with respectfully, and things that you've quoted of ministers who called people animals, which I think is deplorable language, but he was specifically talking about Hamas, not about Palestinians. Now, the reason why you believe that is because you read it in the newspapers that said, look at this minister who called Palestinians animals, and that's not true. He called Hamas animals, and I don't think we should be calling anybody animals. That's horrible language, but you see how we take one thing and we flip it into something else, and then it gives the impression that, look, these people are bad, they're calling human beings animals. I agree with you also. I was nodding when you said that genocide has to do with intent. We can't just look at the population from 48 and look at the population now. Clearly, since October 7th, there have been people dying. You don't have to have millions of people to die for it to be a genocide. You know, thousands of people being killed intentionally is a genocide, but it exactly is on intent. Israel's actions is always to fire at Hamas. And if its intention was to target civilians, why is it that when it fires at Hamas, it sends leaflets from drones and planes warning the civilians to leave? It sends knocker bombs, which is a loud firecracker noise that warns the civilians to go. It calls the phones and text messages the phones of the people in the area, warning them to leave. It really does everything to prevent civilian casualties. And every time that it's attacking, it's always targeting Hamas. So it does have to do with intention. Genocide is the mass murder of an ethnic or specific group of people with the intention to kill them. Now, have many Palestinians died? Yes. Horrible. Breaks my heart that we're in this situation, and even more so that my own people are involved with this situation. I would like for this to end, but the intention from the Israeli side is not necessarily to fix the situation. That's my big critique of the Israeli government. But it's definitely not to kill Palestinians, and we look at it with the specifics of the actions. And if you're claiming that the intentions was to kill Palestinians, then let's go to the specifics. Name me actions, name me times, name me places that there was a situation where Israel specifically attacked with the intention of wanting to kill civilians, and you won't find any. And thankfully you won't find any, because the intention of Israel is not to kill civilians. Now, with these terms, genocide, it didn't start in October 7th to call Israel committing a genocide against Palestinians. This has been said for a long, long time, even when I was a student on college campuses. What do we hear? Apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing, colonization, settlements. Who's responsible for those things in the world? The West has done that. The West has done apartheids, genocides, ethnic cleansing, colonization, settlements. And today's far left, not the left, but the far left, feels so guilty for the crimes of their ancestors that instead of looking in the mirror for what they've done, what they're really doing is pushing off and whitewashing these issues and pushing it on the Jewish people and being used as a scapegoat like it's always have. And it's using the legitimate suffering of Palestinians as a tool to do so. Now, you spoke about the involvement of America in this conflict. I'm against the U.S. foreign aid to Israel. I don't want Israel to be dependent on any other military. That money is not even actually money. It's credits so that Israel can go and buy weapons, and that money and weapons is giving also to the Palestinian Authority, also to Egypt, also to Jordan, also to many countries in the region. And you ask yourself, why are all these players fighting each other? And then you have one country that's really funding and giving those weapons to each person. So I would like to see less of involvement from the United States in this situation and more of bringing voices of real leaders from the Israeli side and Palestinian side to realize that our aspirations actually do not contradict. I don't believe there will ever be a two-state solution. If you ask most Palestinians, they will completely reject that. You ask most Israelis, they'll completely reject that. So we need to move forward towards a one civilization reality. And the reason I say one civilization, it's intentionally ambiguous because there's many potential ways of how to get there. Federation plans, Puerto Rico-style systems, emirate systems, canton systems like in Switzerland. There are many ways of which we can build that. But I think you're right that Palestinians need the right of return. It's not something I want, it's what they want, it's a non-negotiable. Palestinians need to experience freedom from the river to the sea, and what we need is full economic and political control over Israel. What we need is right of return for Jews as well, safety for the Jewish people, and that Jerusalem is our capital. And so when you break these things down, although right now they're positioned against each other, there is a way that we can create a reality that fills all the needs for both.
Okay, amazing point right there. And I'm gonna give you a chance to respond. We got about 20 minutes left. Alejandra. He talked about that he didn't want to see funding to Israel. Pull up the story that just passed in the House or in the Senate with a $95 billion package. Right now, I want to follow the money. So we saw that the Senate passed the $95 billion package, sending aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, right? It was, there it is right there. Biden signed the bill, I believe, last week, April 24th to be exact, $26 billion specifically to Israel. Of that amount, I think 19 billion exactly went to Israel, and 9, 7, somewhere in that range went to humanitarian aid to what's going on in Gaza. So I've actually brought in our friend Connor, because we're going to follow the money a little bit. Especially what's going on, domestic money. But real quick, you don't believe that U.S. should support Israel economically?
Support Israel economically, sure. But that's not what's happening, in my opinion. What's happening is that the U.S. is giving credit to Israel. Imagine you have a gift card, and the only way that you could use that money is by buying weapons. However, it comes with conditions. The conditions are that Israel cannot sell any weapons or technology to any other country without the U.S.'s approval. It cannot buy weapons from any other country or intelligence without the U.S.'s approval. And so what we see is us being dependent, and more aid means more dependency on the United States, which means more of an ability for U.S. to push foreign policy onto Israel. In the 80s, Israel tried to develop the Lavi program, which was for it to develop its own fighter jets, for Israel to be independent and to create its own source for something that it truly needs. And what did America do? They quickly came and shut that down because they wanted Israel to be dependent on their own fighter jets. So I'm welcoming of a relationship with the United States. I grew up in this country. I'm very appreciative of this country. But I would like to see a relationship that is not toxic. Not a relationship where America can come and tell us what we need to do or how they would like to see it. And in a relationship that if it's support, it doesn't come with conditions.
So would you agree that Israel and America are very strong allies?
Yes and no. I mean, I think if you today go to most Americans, although it is changing with the younger generation on a cultural level, more people are pro-Israel. That's because of the past. But I think in the policies, it's structured in a way to make it seem as if they're pro-Israel. But in its actions, it's really keeping us in this loop. I mean, the reason why Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005, which even as a child, I was wearing the orange bracelet being against from it, that was Bush that forced Sharon to do that. Sharon, the prime minister as at the time, is the person who puts the Jews there. Why would he be the ones removing it? So there's been a lot of pressure from the outside, from the U.S., in my opinion, to allow this conflict to continue, really to sell weapons to both sides and profit. And so I would like a healthy relationship with the United States. I don't want Saudi Arabia or Qatar or the US or any other country coming into this situation. I would like Israelis and Palestinians to start speaking to each other. Right now, when we see on college campuses, is all the Palestinian students and their allies are speaking to the rest of the world, and all the Jewish students are speaking to the rest of the world, instead of speaking to each other. Actually, on the campus is the place where we have freedom of speech, where we can actually engage with one another, learn about the identity, aspirations, suffering, history, and future that we'd like to see from both peoples. And so my message is the only future that we'll see is one that is together, and it could only come when we start uniting and realizing that our aspirations do not actually contradict.
So, foreign policy, foreign aid, you're pretty much against what's going on there. I believe, and I'm not as knowledgeable about this, Israel should be sort of grateful that America is its strongest ally. Without America, who knows what the hell can happen in Israel? We just saw Iran shoot hundreds and hundreds of drones and missiles at Israel. It cost, I think, $1 billion to defend that. So there is a case to be made for the military-industrial complex with the credits. You give all this money here, how many? $19 billion, but that needs to be used to buy more weapons. Totally understand that. You make a great case. That's foreign. Domestic. You talked about what's going on campus, engaging. It's not a lot of engagement going on. I see a lot of shutting down conversation. I see a lot of protest. I see what looks like sort of whiny babies about a very grown-up conflict, and then they're shutting down any types of conversation. But it doesn't seem to be organic. It seems to be organized. And that's why I brought one of Valuetainment's staff writers here. Connor's in the house. Connor, you've been doing some very good research on this left-wing dark money from George Soros. There's actually an image that I want to show, if we can show that. So anti-Israel protests at college campuses are led by activists revealed to be paid fellows of George Soros-connected groups with significant support from U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Fellows are instructed to rise up and reject reform, receiving payments from $3,000 to $8,000 per individual. You've actually done sort of like a CIA web sort of connect the dot situation here with George Soros, Open Society, and everything there. If you can show the image here. But Connor, you and Shane, shout out to VT.com. Check out their articles there. What have you found here? What is actually going on? Follow the money behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's true. I felt like a crazy person going through this as I, made my strings and my notes to connect all the things together. But what this reveals is that the protests we have seen on campus in the last couple months are not as organic as the media would have us believe. They are, in fact, organized from the top down by some of the biggest money groups on the planet. They are structured from the top down, and then money is kicked from group to group until it ends up in the pockets of the people who are running these protests. Now, to your point, I am not trying to describe individual protesters as monolithic. They all have their own motivations for being there. Activism is an individual thing. They are doing what they think is right, depending on whatever their convictions are. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I am saying is that the organizations that put these things together have a direct pipeline that leads back to people at the very top. This is not a grassroots movement. So like Adam said, let's follow the money.
That's George Soros at the top. If you can pan out, thank you, Alejandro.
Yeah, I'll consult the screen right here. As you can see, George Soros is at the top. We're all familiar with who he is. Billionaire, Jewish, one of the most recognizable names in global philanthropy around the world.
Okay.
His political action group, his arm for doing things around the world, is the Open Society Foundation. That is, how he distributes his money to different organizations. A lesser-known subsidiary of the Open Society Foundation is called the Tide Center. This is a big nonprofit group that is sort of an umbrella corporation for a bunch of smaller activist groups, where they can get under the Tide Center and be covered from having to pay taxes. Its other groups include BLM and several other left-wing protest groups like that. This group has received hundreds of millions of dollars in government funding and donations They have over $431 million in assets as of 2022. And by the way, a lot of our information on this comes from Influence Watch, which is a great resource for tracking how money is passed around to these organizations. So the Tide Center has all this money that comes from Soros and the Open Society Foundation. Then that money is passed on to a bunch of smaller groups, including one called Westpac, which is the Westchester People's Action Coalition. They support the BDS movement, the Green New Deal, and they've frequently clashed with the ADL and other Jewish rights groups over their perceived anti-Semitism. The Westpac group funds a group called Students for Justice in Palestine. That's who's carrying out most of the on-campus protests right now. They are responsible for the one at Columbia and a number of others. That group is also affiliated with a group called American Muslims for Palestine, allegedly at least, and their finances aren't disclosed, but they do receive directly and credit Westpac for a lot of the money they have been able to use. For Columbia specifically, the Students for Justice in Palestine partnered with a group called Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a ostensibly Jewish organization that is, again, partnered with a bunch of anti-Israel activists. And they receive, again, millions of dollars, not only from the Open Society Foundation, but also from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And those two groups also fund the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights.
So here's what I want to know, Connor. And look, I'm trying to connect all these dots here.
It's a lot of information.
Yes, it's a lot of information, and I appreciate this. Thank you. So you're connecting these dots. Here's what I got. These protests on college campuses. Columbia, Cornell, Minnesota, Texas, California, USC, Emory, Atlanta. If I'm just a normal person, I'm just, these students really care. They really care about what's going on. But the reality is, what you've just informed us, is that they're not organic. They're completely organized by George Soros and left-wing money. I can't
necessarily say the people don't care about it.
No, they care clearly.
The people organizing the individual students.
And you brought up a good point. Why do they all have the exact same colored tents? Because they're buying in bulk, yes?
Yeah, you buy in bulk, and that's how you get all the same things. It's
and I'm definitely not saying that those college kids, and I kind of feel like you'd be out there protesting for this. Respect, they believe in this, kind of, because there's also tons of people going out and interviewing these people. They're like, what do you mean river to the sea? They're like, yeah, I have no clue what river or what sea. I have no clue what BDS is. I have no clue about apartheid. I just don't want a war. Who the hell wants a war? Nobody. Well, Hamas did. But here's the last point that I want to understand about Soros. What is their purpose? What is their motivation? George Soros is claimed to be Jewish. I think he just is way more politically or ideologically motivated than religion. I actually don't think he has any religion. I think he has a God complex or a Messiah complex. I think he wants to see an open society, open borders. But in summary, what do you think George Soros and this left-wing dark money actually want to see?
I think it is more about anti-Western sentiment than it is about Judaism, Israel, Palestine, any of that. It is about dismantling things here. So, in this debate, we've seen, the Israeli side, the pro-Palestine side. What I'm presenting a little bit here is the American side of things, of people who are, kind of standing at a distance from it, trying to figure out where we fit into this.
Yeah.
And what that means is that there are interests funding both sides of it, and both sides don't care about the American side. That one side or the other wants us to take a stand on it and get involved at the other's expense. And that's where the problem comes in. It's more about harming America, at least with this pipeline of funding, than it is about helping anybody else.
Got it. Thank you, Connor. Check out his articles on VT.com. Last segment, guys.
Wait, Adam, do you not see how ironic it is? How is this not I just think it's so ironic that you're literally insinuating that a single Jewish billionaire is behind this. How is this not just textbook anti-Semitic tropes of you have one Jewish man behind the scenes pulling the strings? Like, is it really so unbelievable that a bunch of kids that go to a college like Columbia can afford like $27 tents from Amazon to like do these protests?
It's almost like you didn't listen to one thing he just said and we're waiting to give the canned response. Yes, I do believe that George Soros is that corrupt. Yes, I do believe that George Soros is that evil. I don't think that many college kids have a lot of money. I do believe that he has billions. And I believe that he's completely trying to build this open society and have a nation, have a world with no borders. Yes, I do believe that. And just because someone's born Jewish, I don't think they actually are Jewish. Just because you are born Christian and you start doing wildly ridiculous things, someone says, well, he was Christian, or just because you were born Muslim. So no, I think that is bullshit to actually think that he's on the side of anything but himself and corrupting society.
Who is a Jew in your eyes then?
Here's what I'll do. Let's actually try to end on a positive note, because I don't think George Soros is doing anything to help society, but we will. You're very pro-Palestinian.
Yes.
You're very pro or anti-war. Would you say that you're anti-Israel?
No.
Would you say that you're anti-Jewish?
No.
Okay. You're very pro-Israel. You're also very pro-American. Would you say you're pro-American? Mm-hmm. When you hear chants like from Iran or even Palestinian protesters chanting death to America, how do you feel about that?
Not my thing.
What do you mean?
I'm not pro anyone's chanting death to America.
Okay, so you're pro-America.
Yeah, sure.
Good, we're on the same page here. You're also pro-Palestinian.
Yeah. Look, I believe America has a right to exist and that Americans should definitely not be targeted. But I'm very critical about America's involvement in foreign policy in the Middle East. And I wouldn't say that I'm just pro-Palestinian as a human rights cause. I'm pro-Palestinian as a family cause. These are my people. There is no future where my children will not be raised with their children on this land that we are eternally connected to. So it's more than just, oh, I happen to be pro-human being no matter who it is. Palestinians, there's an extra degree of closeness with them. So I'm not pro-Israel. I am Israel. Same way that I didn't wake up this morning realizing, oh, I'm going to be pro-Rudy today. I'm obviously pro my own interest. So Jews aren't pro-Israel. We are Israel. And I am pro-Palestinian very much so.
So what I want to do is, there's been talk of this two-state solution forever. Trump just came out and deeply criticized Netanyahu today. If you can pull that up right there. I want both of you, who seem to be very obviously engaged in this and literally engaged in battle. You were in Gaza fighting what I believe are terrorists. Trump is now ripping Netanyahu over October 7th, saying the Hamas attack should have never happened. That's literally today he said that. Thank you, Trump. What's your solution? If you can bring some solution to this that's realistic. I'm going to let you go first, and then I'm going to give Rudy the final word. What's your solution to try to make this a peaceful arrangement to end where both sides can live together? Because when I hear from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, sounds great, but that means eliminating all the Jews from Israel. How many Jews live in Israel?
About 8 to 9 million.
All right, so it's only another Holocaust, no big deal. The world seemed to be okay with that in the 40s. What's your solution? What should be done with Israel? Because every time there's a negotiation, it's always the Palestinians that reject it. So I would love to see a Palestinian, whether it's Fatah or PLA or fucking Hamas, say, okay, Israel has the right to exist. Here's what we want. But unfortunately, they want from the river to the sea. By the way, do you know what river and what sea we're talking about?
The Jordanian River and the Mediterranean Sea.
That a girl? I'd be willing to venture that most protesters have no clue. What would you like to see? 1 minute or less.
This is the million-dollar question. This is a conflict that spans several decades. It's been attempted to be solved by several American presidencies, so many different prime ministers, so many different foreign dignitaries. I don't think I could tell you in one succinct way that I have the solution.
No, not you, but speaking on behalf of, I'm putting you as sort of like the poster child of literally the kids protesting to divest and boycott and sort of be anti-Israel, anti-war. What would you like to see? What's realistic?
I would favor any solution that meets certain conditions. So one that institutes the right of return for Palestinian refugees, that puts an end to the ongoing occupation, that puts an end to the blockade, and ideally a secular democratic state where both Israelis and Palestinians have equal rights in all territories. Okay. Whether that be a one-state or two-state solution, my personal opinion is on that is kind of irrelevant. I think that the international legal framework favors a two-state solution. I personally don't have a preference towards one or two states. If it were, as long as those preconditions are met, I would be satisfied.
So, Rudy, I'm going to let you kind of wrap this thing up, but you know, Israel and Netanyahu has been very clear in order for there to be a ceasefire. By the way, there was a ceasefire on October 6th. Hamas broke the ceasefire. I think that's fair to say. They've been very clear. We want our hostages back. Until we get our children back, you've said that, you know, Israelis and Palestinians are cousins in our family. Well, Israel has been known to want to get their children back, the children of Israel. They said, yeah, there's zero ceasefire until we get the hostages back. Hamas has actively declined this. They don't care if Palestinians end up dead. Anthony Blinken basically said, Hamas, take it or leave it. Take this frickin' deal. Do you have that article about the ceasefire? Show that. U.S. is now hopeful Hamas will accept Israel's newest ceasefire offer to Hamas. Blinken said that it was extraordinary generous offer. The Gaza war, U.S. hopeful will accept a ceasefire. Hamas has shown no indications that it's going to happen. Rudy, final word here. What's going to happen? How will there be a ceasefire? What would you like to see this solution? On one end, there's the two-state solution. On one end, we've heard the final solution for Jews for all too long. What is actually a realistic solution here?
So to conclude here, I'll definitely go right back and say George Soros, even though he might be acting against the Jewish people, is a Jew no matter what, because we're not a belief system, we're an actual ancient civilization and native people, and he is acting against the Jews, and to call him out for doing so is not anti-Semitic either. So there's nuance within both of what you said. There's the short term and there's the long term. Short term, with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict right now happening with Gaza, we must bring back all the hostages, we will bring them home, we must take out Hamas and remove them from power, we must install security for Israel and the Palestinians and all the civilians that are living in this land. That's number one. Now on the long term, in order to get there, we need to understand the injustices that are happening on both sides, because there is no peace without justice on both sides. We need to understand the aspirations that both people have. In order to get to a solution, it must include both for both peoples. A two-state solution actually does neither for either, because both peoples want to live from the river to the sea, and so already doesn't achieve the aspirations. And because there's no aspirations, there will be conflict and fighting, which will only lead to continued injustice and insecurity. So any solution that will come will be a journey, will be a process, will not be a piece of paper printed by a US printer, brought to the Israelis, and Israelis and Palestinians have to sign that. It will be a process and a journey for which Israelis and Palestinians will begin to rise up, understand that we're not only human beings, but cousins to each other, that we both belong into this land, and Israelis need to start hearing what are the needs of Palestinians, what are their identities, what are their experiences, what are their aspirations, and Palestinians need to do the same to the Israeli people. For me, it is only one civilization solution. And again, it's intentionally ambiguous because there's many potential ways in which that can happen, where Israelis and Palestinians have freedom from the river to the sea, are treated equally, but also we're able to achieve our ancient aspirations of having Jerusalem as our holy capital city, as having Israel as our reinstated civilization and country. Now, the problem with the right of return for Palestinians in this equation is usually demographics. Now, I work on a big project that maybe in the next time we can talk about, on a project called We Were Never Lost, which is bringing tribes of Israel back to Israel. Today, the 15 million Jews are the descendants of 2.5 tribes out of 12, which means we have 9.5 tribes still out there that if they were to return, the demographics of Palestinians returning back home would not threaten the idea of a Jewish democracy to the Jewish people. So there are ways of getting to the solution, but the solution will never happen on either side if we don't look at the injustices Palestinians face and realize that as Israelis, although we didn't create it, we do have the power now to correct it and to fix it, and we have a responsibility to do so. And Palestinians need to understand that the Jews aren't foreigners. We are the indigenous people to the land. If you dig in the land, you find our history, you find our archaeology, you find our anthropology. We are the people that are indigenous from them. There's nowhere else that we're going to go. Even if we had other places we could go, we wouldn't go there. So there's an acceptance that needs to come from both sides and an understanding that there is no future without the other.
I love it. This has been an amazing conversation. I think we need more of these conversations. Here's how I'd like to conclude this. You each can say literally one thing. What's the one thing he said that you're like, you know what? I didn't know that. Thank you for that information. I'm willing to consider that. And same for you. Oh, okay, cool. Never heard that. Good point. What's the one thing that maybe changed your perspective about the Israeli position?
I feel like speaking with you today, it's hard to say that it's I think we both are familiar with the points that the other person were making, where we agree and disagree is obviously what we were hashing out. But I did think it was interesting for you to frame it as like one civilization. You know, I've never heard that framing from somebody who considers themselves pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian or, interested in this conflict. And I do think that that is like an interesting way of like framing the conversation beyond just looking at statehood purely, right? So that's something else.
Fair enough. You have this conversation all the time. Clearly, you know your stuff. Respect to you. From using her as sort of a symbol of what's going on amongst these campus protests, what did she say, or what resonated with you? It's like they do have a good point there. What's the final thing you want to say there?
So yeah, this is what I do. So I can't say there's something new that I've heard, but I can see in your essence and in your soul you truly care about human life. You're not here to be against Israel, against the Jewish people, and you want justice for the Palestinians, and from that I respect that. And I know that your intentions are pure, and in the final reality of what we'd like to see, we wouldn't disagree. And I think if we had more conversations like this on platforms like yours, on other platforms, on college campuses, we'd realize that the true intentions and ambitions that the collectives had, Israelis and Palestinians, are not contradictory, and all those who are allies to each cause, let's say non-Jews that are pro-Israel, non-Palestinians that are pro-Palestinian, they all need to realize that they need to help us come together, not be pulling us apart.
All right. Thank you. Rudy, thank you for what you do, genuinely, on behalf of people that support Israel and Zionists. And thank you for being respectful and open-minded and being willing to share your opinion. And thank you guys for being here. Sub to the channel, SOSCAST, here on Valuetainment. Rudy's channel, Rudy Rochman.
Or on Instagram, Rudy_Israel. Israel's my Hebrew name.
I keep saying the CH, it's Rochman.
Rochman.
But it's the CH that gets
It's all
me.
good, you're Ashkenazi.
And then not so erudite on...
No, that's Kyla.
I mean, that's Kyla, sorry.
I'm
Why did I say that? Straighterade.
I think it's because we both have black hair.
That's what, I mean, I know the difference between Aaron and Kyla. Anyway, Straighterade on there. I appreciate this conversation, and more to come, only here on Valuetainment. See you guys later.
It's the SOSCAST, baby.
I don't know why I thought...